Alrighty folks, it's time for the rubber to hit the road. We're now going to go ahead and create our first pipeline within your Azure DevOps organization. What we're going to do is create a build pipeline that's going to build all the assets required for our sample web application. And to do that, we'll use the repository that we set up in the earlier GitHub demonstration. But if you prefer, you could actually just go ahead and clone my Aus-E-Mart repository to your Azure DevOps project. Once we've got that build pipeline ready to go, we're going to create a release pipeline that will deploy the solution to production. Now, for the purpose of that, we're also going to use a click to deploy resource just to have a virtual machine in Azure ready to go to serve the purpose of our production web server. Alrighty, so to follow along, make sure you are logged into your Azure DevOps organization, and we will also need to use the Azure subscription a little bit later on as well. Then what we're going to do is browse into your project. We're going to navigate into the pipeline section on the left-hand side, and we're going to create our first pipeline. So click on the Create Pipeline option, and what we'll do within this demonstration is we'll actually keep things simple just whilst we get started, and we'll use the classic editor to create this pipeline. But a lot of times what you're actually going to do is use the YAML pipeline functionality, because that's what Microsoft is developing all the new functionality and features for. And also because if you develop your pipeline using YAML, you can even in fact store your pipeline as code, and so you can store that within a repository also. However, for us, we're going to go ahead, use the classic editor, and then what I have to do is select the repo that contains the solution code. So I'm going to go and choose the other Git option, but what you could actually choose to do is choose GitHub, and you could authorize using your username and password. You could use Azure Repos if you've actually cloned the repository to the Azure Repos here within your project. Or you could just use a public repository by choosing the other Git option, and that's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Add Connection, and I'll just open up a new tab and quickly access my GitHub repository. So if we take a look at the repositories on the left-hand side, you'll see I'm logged into the repository that we created in an earlier demonstration. It's got my copy of the Aus-E-Mart web application, and it will include any modifications that you've made from your local repository that you've gone ahead and pushed here. So what I'll do is I'll click on the code option at the top right, and then I'll take a copy of this Git URI, and I'll go back into my Azure DevOps organization, and I'll paste that in. Now I don't actually have to enter in a username and password, but if you were using any other Git service where you did have those credentials, you could type those in here. Also, if you preferred, if you haven't actually set up the repository from the earlier demonstrations, you could just enter in my public repository here, and I'll include a link to that within the description below. So let's go ahead and click on OK. That's actually going to go and create a service connection, which is something that can be used to connect to external resources across my project. I'm going to make sure that we're using the main branch, which is the branch name for my repository in GitHub, and I'm going to go ahead and click on Continue. Now, once again, just because the purpose of this demonstration is to help you get started using pipelines and help to see what sort of features and functionality and steps we can automate, we're just going to keep things simple by using one of the built-in templates. For that, I'm going to search for .NET, and I'll actually choose the ASP.NET Core option right here, and I'll click on Apply. That's going to set up a range of different tasks for us ready to go that we can use, that we can modify to suit our purposes. So first things first, I'm going to give this pipeline a name. We'll just call this Web Store Build, and then you'll see we can specify some details about the agent pool. Now what you could choose to do is use the self-hosted option if you have optionally gone ahead and set up your own virtual machine as an Azure DevOps agent, or you can use the Microsoft hosted option if you do have the free tier. I'm going to choose the private pool because that's where I have set up my own agent. And we actually do need to make some changes here to the parameters. Okay, if we take a look at the repository, you'll see that we only have a single .NET application. It's not part of a larger solution, and so that's why we've got the CS proj file there rather than a big solution file. So accordingly, we need to browse back to the correct tab, sorry about that, and type in the correct extension, which is CS proj. We can leave the artifact name as drop. That's just a pretty common standard that is used to refer to the build artifacts that you will create by this pipeline. Next, what we want to do is browse into agent job, and you'll see that that's already ready to go, but I will just call out that what this is actually doing here is it's saying These are the different things that I'm going to require from my agent to be able to perform the tasks set out within this pipeline. So you can actually go and specify a range of different demands that you have that your agent will need to meet for it to be used. So if you've got a large agent pool with lots of different agents, you can specify their capabilities, and therefore this can automatically go and pick an agent that will meet your needs. So we don't need to change anything there, but we do need to make some changes to the NuGet packet tool. So click on that option. And we're just going to change the display name here to use NuGet 6.4.0, and we'll also change the version there to 6.4.0. Now you don't need to worry too much about all of these tasks. What we're really talking about here are the tasks that you would commonly be performing if you were doing this manually on a computer. So we might need to retrieve some packages that's used by our solution. We of course are going to need to build the solution. We might choose to test it as well because we don't want to release that code unless it has passed some tests. And then we can publish it as a build artifact that can be used in an upcoming release pipeline. So for our purposes, for our .NET sample web application, these are all the tasks that we need to build our web app. So that's all the changes you'll need to make. What you can do now is go ahead and click on the Save and Queue dropdown and choose to save. Now we can add some comments here about what changes we've made. I'll just say initialized pipeline because we've only just got this set up. If you're making some other changes in future, you'd probably want to add something a bit more meaningful. So I'll go ahead and click on Save, and that is now ready to go. Now what we can do is we can actually browse back a step to the build pipelines, and you can see we've now got this build pipeline here, but it hasn't yet run. If we click on the drop down ellipses, we can actually go straight away and choose Run Pipeline. You can either do that from the edit window that we were in before, or you can browse back to the main pipelines view and choose to do that. Now what I'm actually doing is triggering this build manually, but what I will say is if you are following true CI/CD practices, you're actually going to have this build automatically running as part of any changes being committed to your repository. However, we're just going to keep things simple, so we're going to trigger this pipeline manually. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make sure I've got the private default pool selected. I'm using the main branch, and I'll just go straight ahead and choose Run. Now this will take some time. If you want to view more details, you can browse into the actual job itself and see exactly what is happening. You can check this out if there are any errors or if you'd just like to get more information. So this will take some time. I'm going to pause the video and we'll pop back once it's ready to go. All right, fantastic. When your build looks something like this and it has completed, you'll see it's ready to go. And you might be thinking, what now? What has it done? We don't have a web application. Well, that's because so far we've only automated the build portion of our pipeline, and we might have actually wanted to include some test features there as well. So very important steps, but not the full picture. What we want to do now is we want to browse into releases, and we want to create a release pipeline that can deploy our solution to production, for example. Now, as part of this release pipeline, what we could in fact go and do is actually deploy some infrastructure all brand new, ready to go, or we could actually have Azure DevOps track some virtual machines, for example, that host our solution. So to keep things nice and simple, we're not going to deploy any infrastructure as part of our release pipeline. What we'll do instead is we're going to set up some deployment groups that we can deploy our solution to. So to set up a deployment group or a set of virtual machines that we can use for our deployment, we're going to go ahead and we're going to click on the Add a Deployment Group option. I'm going to specify a name. Let's call that Prod Web Servers. We'll go ahead and click on Create. Now, as per usual, you can follow these steps manually if you would like to, but what I have actually done within this demo is included a template that you can click to deploy to speed up the process. But to actually do that, you will need to have some security set up. So we're going to browse up the top right, click on our profile, choose Security, and then you're going to need to create a new personal access token. So click on the new token option, and let's just call this Deployment Group. I would encourage you to actually set the expiration as really low, or make sure at least that you come back and delete this personal access token once we have finished this setup. Now for this personal access token, we do need to give it the permission to scroll down here, find deployment groups, read and manage deployment groups. We can go ahead, tick that option and choose create, and it's going to create this token for you, but you're only going to see this once. So make sure you take a copy of that and store it somewhere safe. All right, now once you've got that ready to go, we've got all of the details that we really need to go ahead and set up this deployment group. So to keep things simple, you can open up a new tab. Just make sure you have already logged into your Azure subscription, and you can paste in the link to the Deploy to Azure button that I've included within the description for this demo. You can go ahead, paste that in and press enter. And then I'm just going to enter in all of the details that we need here to set up our new virtual machine. So I'll create a new resource group. Let's call that web VMs-RG. I'll click on OK. I'm going to place this within Australia East. I'll leave it as standard B2S. That's perfectly okay for our purposes. I'm going to enter in a username and password. And I'm going to leave all of the other settings as is. Now, firstly, you're going to have to make sure that you paste in the pat that you just created, and then you'll need to enter in the DevOps account name. That's really the organization. So my scenario, that's Aus-E-Mart, and then I'll need to enter in the project name. If you forget what you've set for these, you can browse back to your DevOps organization and you can take a look. So for my project, I've got Aus-E-Mart Stores, so that's what I'll enter in here, Aus-E-Mart Stores. And for the deployment group, I can browse back once again, open up my project, go into Pipelines, choose the deployment groups option, and I'll see what I've got there for my name, which is Prod Web Servers. So I'll enter that in here, and I'll leave everything else is and go ahead and click on Create. Now this will take some time. There's a couple of extensions that need to be installed on the virtual machine once all of the other infrastructure is ready to go. So I'll pause the video and pop back once this is complete. Okay, once that's ready to go, we should be able to browse back to Azure DevOps and you'll see we've got the healthy deployment groups ready to go, including the virtual machine that you just set up. Now, we'll also note that this virtual machine is set up ready to go with IIS installed, as well as the .NET hosting bundle. So there's nothing further that we need to do on this virtual machine. Now, we have taken a little bit of a shortcut by doing it that way, and it is worth noting that these are some tasks that we could have performed through the pipeline itself. But it's really up to every organization how they do this. Do you want to have images for your virtual machines? Are you going to customize it? Do you already have a fleet of virtual machines up and ready to go? Okay, but that's not our focus within this demo. What we want to see within this demo is how we can use build and release pipelines. So now that we've got the infrastructure, let's head on over to the releases section and create a new release pipeline. In this release pipeline, we're actually going to take the build that we created earlier and we're going to deploy it to the deployment group that we just configured. So once again, to keep things nice and straightforward, we'll go to the search option and we're going to search for .NET. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use the built-in IIS website deployment operation here. So I'll click on Apply and we'll just give this stage a name of Production. When you're working with Azure Pipelines and specifically looking at release pipelines, they have the notion of these different things here kind of being like environments, if you like. But stages is a term that is much more acceptable for the different purposes that you might actually be using. So we're just going to say this is the production stage. We'll X on that. And then we're going to make sure that we've actually got the build artifact that we're going to use to deploy to our production deployment group. So I've clicked on the artifact section on the left-hand side, and I'm going to choose the existing build artifact that we created from our web store build pipeline earlier. So I'll go ahead and click on Add. And then what we can do is we can browse into the Jobs and Tasks option here and make sure we've got everything that we need. Firstly, I'll go into IIS deployment settings here, and I'll make sure that we're deploying to the deployment group we just configured. And then I'm going to browse into the IIS Web App Manage task, and I'm actually going to go ahead and remove this because we've already got IIS already configured on the deployment group that we are deploying to. But as you can see here, we could actually change the settings. We could make sure it matches our requirements. We could even go and deploy IIS if we wanted. I'm going to choose Remove, and then we'll just take a look at our IIS Web App Deploy task. And there's actually really nothing that we need to change here. This has all of the settings that we require to go and deploy our solution to the IIS default website that is already configured. So what we can do is we can browse back to the pipeline view. We can give this a new name and we'll just call this Production Release. And we can go ahead and click on Save. I'll just say Init for our initial setup and go ahead and click on OK. And then we're ready to go. So now that we've got everything that's been configured, we had our build pipeline. We've run that pipeline. It's created a build artifact. I'm now going to go ahead and click on Create a Release. But before I do just want to mention that typically, if you're actually going to have continuous integration and continuous deployment, these would not be manual tasks. You could have them manual if you're still getting started and introducing more DevOps maturity, but ultimately you probably want to have a continuous deployment trigger here that's going to go and take the build as soon as the build is created and deploy it to production. Now that would also depend on our build pipeline having a trigger that is going to build the artifacts necessary whenever there are any changes committed to our repository. So we're not going to use that for now. We just want to understand these core components. We can go ahead and nice and easily do that manually by clicking on Create Release. That's all we need to do. Go ahead straight away and click on Create. Now that will take some time. As always, we can browse into the release and get more information about what is actually happening, but I'll pause the video and pop back once this is complete. Okay, now as soon as that release has finished, what we can do is we can browse across to our Azure subscription. We can go to the resources that we deployed earlier. And what I'll do is I'll browse into the virtual machine and let's just take a copy of that public IP. Now I'll open up a new tab, I'll paste that in, and fantastic, there you have it. We've got the Aus-E-Mart web application version 2 that incorporated my changes from my local repository all ready to go. So everybody, now you've seen the key components of using Azure DevOps. We've taken a repository that we built over time from our own local Git repository. We've integrated that with a service connection to Azure DevOps, and then we've used that within 2 pipelines, one for building all of the compiled artifacts that we require, and then the second, which will release it to our production deployment group. So everybody, thanks so much for joining me. I really hope you've enjoyed it, and that's a wrap for these Getting Started demos.